Welcome back to The Core. We're talking about human relations and world missions. Very specifically, the relationship between a missionary and his home church, the sending church. Categorically, under that heading, we are talking about the relationship of the brothers of the church. The sending church population itself, already establishing the pastoral relationship with the missionary and the pastor of the sending church. We've been talking about the brothers in the church and how sometimes there will be opposition and resistance, like Joseph with his brothers, but that we as a congregation work to support and bless our missionaries. And the last time we were together, I told you about the Christmas tree story and how people provided for me and gave me a budget to be able to enjoy the holiday season while on the mission field. And I got that big, beautiful Christmas tree, and it brought me to my knees in tears, and I thank God for it to this day. And that's where we were looking at prayer, communication. These are areas of responsibility on the part of the congregation toward the missionary. And the third one we see here is finances. So it's understood by both the pastor and the congregation that the missionary is an extension of the local church and that he or she represents all who have sent him to the foreign field. It will also be understood and accepted that there is a financial obligation that goes along with the endeavor. In other words, in an obligation according to whatever the church can afford or whatever the church can do. Some churches are larger, and when it comes to finances, the brothers and the sisters that are working have enough income that they can pool their resources and support the missionaries. There are priorities in the local church, of course. We take care of those. I have supported missionaries through the years, and the ministries that I have begun or the churches that I've planted have supported missionaries and paid for things, but I really do believe that as they go forward, they need to find their own support. And if they do this, they'll find their real worth and value also. I believe that yes, we need to support them, but in the initiation. And then later they will find avenues through which they can be blessed and provision for their ministries. And so it really has a lot to do with the people that we're feeding. I found when it comes to finances for the missionary, finances for any ministry for that matter, the simple principle of the muzzle of the mouth of the ox. If you are treading out the grain of harvest in a given field, there you should be allowed to eat. If you are feeding, if you're caring, if you are working in that harvest, then the people of that harvest will be able to contribute and be a blessing to your life. They will be able to give money to help you, support your ministry. And that is how I have been alive on earth as a pastor for all these years, as a missionary at times, supported from churches where I grew up. My sending church supported me faithfully for the first years that I was out there. Of course, when I went to language school, not only did I not get paid, I had to pay the language school and I had to pay the rent my place. Well, that was entirely supplied in my first year by my home church. By that second year, as I went on, that money was adjusted, and little by little the adjustments increased, diminishing the amount, giving me the chance to spread my support base to other areas. But in the beginning, and I'm talking to the congregation and in their obligations, our obligations toward the missionaries that we're sending, in the beginning we will be the vast majority of their support. And if you, as an individual in your church, has built these relationships with people in the church, and you have sincerely, without the ruse of a motivation of getting something from the people, but you truly love them in the body of Christ, it will not be a challenge for you to find support. God will reward that. As you have sown into their lives, God will sow into your life through them being motivated to give. And they will give to you. They will bless you. They will love you. And I had this. We had individuals in our home church. In fact, still to this day, I have several supporters. Not huge amounts, but this is the one thing you have to understand. $20 monthly is a lot. $10 monthly is a lot. $1 is something. It all adds up. If you have enough people and enough friends and allies in the sending church, and you have made a relationship with them, then they all will contribute in portions. And when those portions are given to you, it will add up to be the sum total of what you need to do what you're doing on the mission field. And this is what happened when I was sent from my home church. It wasn't just the church itself that was giving me my full support, but individuals decided to contribute as well. Now, there are different policies in different churches, and there are some concepts of leadership in churches not wanting what is called double dipping. And you think, what is double dipping? I'll explain that. Let's say that I have a ministry or a church, and I set up the understanding of missions, and we have people within the congregation that God calls, and they respond to that call, and they're sent out. And I, from the administration of the churches, that is, from the gathered money of tithes and offerings that come into the house, I then have to administratively make decisions about where that money's going and how it's distributed. Well, the people who are giving that money in tithe need to first support who's feeding them, which would be the pastor of the local church. And that would be also to support the structure where that's taking place, the actual corral itself, the building, the unit that we gather together in, if it's rented or it's owned, the upkeep of all that is a priority. The pastor or the shepherd needs to be supported. This is a very biblical thing. If you're enjoying the teachings of someone, you should support that. But you're not necessarily enjoying the teachings of a missionary, are you? They are going out as an extension. So the missionary support does not always fall in the area of the tithe being received as responsible for that, but yet the offerings, because the church has tithes, the 10% people give out of their gross income, and that's a very biblical principle. But after that, there is giving beyond that. There are actually many different kinds of offerings in the Old Testament, but we saw the tithe, and then we saw all these different other kinds of offerings, grain offerings, oil offerings, and wheat offerings, and animal sacrifice, all those things that lent support to the church or what was the temple back then. But today it's like that. The tithe has priorities in the house, and that is to support the infrastructure of that house, that temple, that pastor, that leader, and then after that, the people who support that. Now, missionaries, however, fall into a category where they're going out to other areas. We do help them. We see biblically this pattern of support for missions works coming from individuals. You say, where do you see that? Well, let's start with the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was a missionary. Jesus was functioning in an itinerant ministry, traveling from place to place. Who was paying for him? Individuals. What individuals? The women. They were paying out of their money and what they had to support the ministry of Jesus. And of course, Jesus was integrous with the money, and he was not poor, though, like people think, in the sense of, not having anything at all. He was blessed. His tunic or his garment, his undergarment that the guards fought over and had to cast lots for, and they didn't want to destroy it, was because it was so nice that they wanted to keep it. It was a single weave, full body garment, and it was quite costly back then, very expensive and difficult to make. And so Jesus, day by day, had money coming in. Of course, most of what came into his ministry, he was, I'm sure, giving to the poor, helping the people. But there were sacrifices made to support him individually. It's like that with the missionary. Every one of us. As the missionary goes forward, they are going to be learning and growing. They're not going to be influencing a lot of people at first. So we support them for a while until they can get into a position where they can receive their own support. By what? By the people they're impacting. Now, when you go to a third world country, you go to a place where it's very poor, even those people tithing, it's a very small amount. But we're going to get more into those specific details about those finances later, percentages, etc. Right now, in talking about the congregation's obligations toward the missionary they're sending, it is to aid and help them. So you as an individual, do not take out of your tithe to support a missionary. The reason why I say that is because that's called double dipping. In other words, if you're taking that and giving, and those they're bringing from you, if they're already receiving a support base in the beginning of their ministry, in the first year or 2 years, and you give to them besides, well, in actuality, sometimes you're taking it away from what the church needs, or the church is already giving out of the tithe. So that's where a lot of churches have missions funds. In other words, they do not spend out of the general tithe pool for missionaries, but they have a fund or a separate offering that is taken, or a box in the back of the church, etc. I've seen it done many different ways. But when someone's trusting God, usually this is taken care of in a personal relationship that the missionary has with the people in the congregation from these relationships we're talking about. And I did that with people. When missionaries left my church, I supported them as individuals. And that's exactly what people did. And a lot of times you as the congregation have an attitude of, well, you know, I don't have a lot of money right now, but when I do, I will support your ministry. That's a bad thought. That's a wrong way to think of it, because you don't have a lot of money, but you have money. Anything. What do you have in your pocket? What do you have available? And that's the thing you need to understand, that if many of us contribute, if many of us give $1, $10 in an offering for a missionary, that missionary, what if a missionary has 100 people giving $10? Well, you know, we know that that's $1,000. So 100 people giving $10, you have $1,000 for that missionary. And in some places of the world, that's good income. If you're living as a missionary in Cambodia, you can make it on that, no problem. So let's say you come from a congregation of 100 people in your church from let's say a place like Singapore. And Singapore, of course, is one of the most expensive cities in the world, so $100 is not that much money here. Really, $10 is, like, for us, it's practically nothing. We rarely can get a meal for under $10, and even McDonald's right now is $8, $9 for your combination meal. So it's going up higher and higher. The cheapest is still, the very cheapest you'll pay is maybe $5 or $6 to eat. So $10, what is that in the space of a month for you to give? And a lot of people don't think of it this way. And I just so happened, when that person told me in front of other people in the church that day, when I was a first-year missionary, you know, I don't have a lot of money right now, but when I do, I want to support your ministry. Well, another person standing by, an older sister in the Lord, said, well, what do you have in your pocket now? I said, excuse me? Well, you're thinking that it's a lot that he needs, but every little bit counts. And if you give $10, that's a lot. And I agree. I said, yeah, because I was living at the time in Mexico, which is a very poor area, and $10 could go a long way. My wife used to make a soup to feed 12 people out of about $1.50. And we all called it, you know, the 5 peso soup, or whatever she called it at the time. It was the great soup, but it didn't take much. Just a little bit of chicken to make a stock, and then potatoes and carrots, which were very cheap, and she would make a big stew, delicious, and we would all eat together and have a wonderful time. You can stretch it. But as I say, 100 people in your church, and all of them decide on the side, I'm going to put $10 aside for, you know, Brother Dan, who's gone to the mission field, for Sister Nancy, who's gone to the mission field. They are supported. There it is, just like that. But sometimes we forget that simple process. So some churches form an organization as a congregation to pull that money together to do that very specifically. And that's good too. I just happen to have been in a position through the years to be given money for missions, and I use that money incrementally as I give it out to people who have needs. So individuals, but we are the congregation. Our finances, it's understood we need to do. Ambassadors to foreign nations are always supported by their sending countries and not by the host nation. So we see that same pattern again. The start of our ministry on the mission field, our home church gave us 90% of our funds. And that was because of my relationship with the pastor. Again, he loved us, and he, on the board, he really pushed for that support, and his pressure caused the leaders to agree and give that amount. And later, when he was out of the picture and the other leaders took over, they immediately wanted to reduce that amount and actually do away with it entirely. And I told you the story already when I went to India. But by that time I went to India, I was on the mission field already for a long time. I was on the mission field for 10 years. So by then, you should have gotten some of your own support. And I did, honestly, I did. So there was no problem. So we trust God first. We seek God and His kingdom and His righteousness. The money will find us. But we as the congregation, Let's remember our missionaries. Now I want to talk about the obligation of the missionary to his home church. Like an ambassador, or an emissary, represents his nation, so also the missionary represents his home church and its beliefs. There are certain obligations to properly represent the sending church. One of those obligations we have, I believe, is about our finances. And being that the sending church provides a great deal of the finances that you're using, especially in the beginning, it's important that you be accountable to the leadership of the church with your records of spending. In other words, what is your outgo? What is your income? And be honest with it. Concerning it, especially if it's little, then you be honest, and then they will be able to have wise understanding of your finances. And this can be done by simply sending copies of your personal records to the home church for review. There are two reasons for doing this. Number one, to be accountable. And you will spend with greater care if you know that others will see what you do. In other words, in the beginning, you need to... This is the one thing I'm going to tell you about finances of a missionary. And as we go off into these kind of works that we do, imagine that missions work when you are first starting is like joining a multinational corporation and your first position is in the mailroom. In other words, you are in the basement with the copiers and you're rolling a little cart around handing memoirs to people, or you are delivering files, or you come in on the ground level as a janitor and you're sweeping and mopping. And little by little, what happens? You gain opportunity to advance. Well, as you grow, you get an increment in your salary also. And that's because this organization is very carefully watching you. It's meritocratic, meaning that it rewards merit based upon your function, what you've done. Have you carried your load? Have you been productive? If you caused the greater group to increase, to grow, and so therefore they see that you're doing well, and you have, so they what? They promote you. You get more and more responsibilities, therefore more and more income. They pay you more, and you grow, right? But when you're a missionary, especially when you're not part of a very big hierarchy, which some missionaries are part of, like a mission sending agency, and that agency is very complicated and they have very specific structure and they're like a corporation. Well, there's pros and cons to that. The pros would be a constant and consistent guarantee of an amount of money. The cons to that, even to a consistent amount of money coming in, is a reduction in your dependence upon God in faith. You say, what do you mean? I mean, if you have a guaranteed amount of money coming in every month for you because you're part of a big organization and they can easily support you because they have a huge pool, and a lot of denominations do this, like the Assemblies of God, and individual churches of the Assemblies of God do not support missionaries always straight out of their church. They send the money into a main office, which then breaks down a missionary structure, and they support these missions around the world. And it enables many advantages for that. And certainly the missionary who has that position does not have to worry about raising support, does not have to worry about their income. But what does that really create in that missionary? That missionary is at ease because whatever they do, it's kind of a job security. Whether they do great, don't do it, whatever, hey, someone might not even notice whether they're doing well or not. And so how will they know not to support them with more or less? You understand? Of course, God knows everything, but man has more control in that environment. Now, I've known these missionaries through my life. First of all, I'm not that missionary. I've never been part of a very big organization that has guaranteed me any income. And the one missions group I was a part of years ago, called Gulf States Missions Association, GSMA, it was a great group with great ideals and principles, but they were not a pooling source of finances. They were more of an administration of council and government. But the money still came from individual churches. They arranged for you to be able to solicit funds from different pastors and churches in promotion of missions in general. but they did not guarantee. You could go in and ask them, excuse me, could you help me? We need this amount of money. And they would just kind of say, well, yeah, you need to pray then, because God is the provider. So I understood that, but not so with these guys that were part of denominations. And I remember always being a little jealous of them because I knew them on the mission field, and they would have brand new Mitsubishi pickup trucks and four-wheel drive vehicles, and they just seemed to always have everything they needed. There was never that stress in them and worrying about next month's income and how they would pay. No. They had a project, they wanted to plant a church, they want to do an orphanage, they want to do an outreach program, whatever. They just had to write a letter to their main office and funds would be released accordingly. All they need to do is provide receipts. So basically it was just arbitrary choices. Well, I've never had that. Every single project through the years, every feeding program, every support of orphanages, every library, every church plant, every tent, every crusade, everything had to be gathered by me and my influence and relationship with people based upon my faith and my prayers. My monthly support as well. It was based upon my faith and it was according to my faith. There were no guarantees. Now, so we have two missionaries here, right? You have a missionary that's under support, doesn't have to worry about anything. Wow, good for him. Then you have a missionary here that has to worry about everything and constantly seeking. He is not part of a support group that will guarantee anything. So which one of these you think operates more in the realms of faith? It's a rhetorical question. Of course, the missionary over here who does not have an organization, he does not have someone guaranteeing him money, he has to pray. And you have to pray always. Every day you have to pray and ask God and beg, and you have to bite your nails without the guarantee when the bills are coming each month and you want to do a project. You don't have a pool of money to work from always. You need to believe God. And often you will not choose not to do something because you don't have the money beforehand. And that's where you have to learn that that's not how faith works. Now, I have been pushed into a realm of faith and believing God for these things because I was never given a guaranteed amount of money. Even then, churches would say they would and they wouldn't. I've had 100 promises from pastors about financial support that they reneged on and did not do. I've had pastors say in front of their congregations that we as a church, we're going to support this ministry and we're going to give this X amount of dollars and and the whole church clapped, amen, praise God. I never saw a penny of it. And you say, what, did they lie? No, it's not lying. They just had an idea and thought, wouldn't this be ideal? Wouldn't this be great? And some people enjoy the circumstance, meaning they enjoy the atmosphere by the declaration and don't always fulfill what they said they would do. However, I had other people who have been extremely faithful. I have one individual supporter of my ministry, Dr. Andy Garrett, DDS, a dentist. For 35 years of my ministry has never not supported me every single month. So much through all these years that he has hardwired his missionary support to me into his retirement plan so that I will continue to be supported even now that he's retired until the day he dies. And I don't know what he's done. Knowing him, he probably has some plan that will keep me supported for years after he's even dead. Gosh, you cannot find that kind of fidelity on earth very commonly. Such a wonderful man of God. Such a blessing. He's the perfect. If I had 10 or 20 of those kind of people in my life, there would never be a question of money. I would never even think about it. I would just operate and I would go and blow and move and take and do and preach and plant and do the work of the ministry all the time. But that's not always how it works. We work by faith. And I thank God that I have been forced. So therefore, if you look at my perspective as the missionary to the church, I need to tell people what my money is and I'm accountable to them. I want the church to know my needs. Otherwise, how will they be moved to help me? And often the missionary has needs that the missionary doesn't see as urgent. But when the people of the home church hear about it, they're like, well, we can do this. And this happens to me all the time. I have a sweet couple working in Bali right now that are under our ministry at Antioch, Bali, and they're working in, this is Quentin and Harni, real blessing, and Quentin's probably watching this right now. Love you, brother. He went through our program years ago. And they have a minimal amount, and they work and function under that, and sometimes they bring up things that they call desires or dreams that I see as needs, and until when I hear them, I'm like, oh yeah, here, take this, here's some money. But if I don't hear about it, you understand? And so it is important that there be a connection. Right now in our ministry at Antioch, Caleb is the one communicating with the missionaries. What do they need? I need someone that is constantly asking them. I too will communicate with them, but usually about personal things. But Caleb's asking for prayers. And when you ask someone to pray, any missionary praying, they're going to be praying for money. I'm sorry, but that's everybody, because that's the way the world goes around. We pay for things. Of course, we pray to the Lord for souls above all. But even souls, you need money to be able to get those souls saved, to be able to reach them. How can they go without a preacher? And how can he preach if he's not sent? So in the sending, how do we send? We pay. Sending is traveling. Traveling is expensive. You need to pay for all these things. So I need to be accountable to my home church as a missionary. That's one of my obligations. And it's a good idea to have an accountant. If you're not really good at finances, I write here, have an accountant for this. And that way if you can't keep good records yourself. And in the past, I was never really good at this. But now, thank God, we have bank apps and everything we spend and do, because money is becoming electronic and money flows through e-commerce now. It's on record. And so everything is there. I can easily see exactly where every penny is going and where it's coming from, and makes it easier. But it's important that you be able to have that in your personal finances, that you be, as a missionary, accountable to your home church, and that the church knows your needs so that they can do something about that. In communication, we have a responsibility. A missionary can be faithful in sending reports of his finances, but be negligent in communicating his personal feelings and vision. And this is where a newsletter comes in, and we will discuss this at length later in this series. I will give you a breakdown of communication in details, but for now, there are two themes of your communication in general here that I want to talk about. First is the fruit of your ministry. This is all that you are accomplishing in the ministry. Now, this is a challenge to us as missionaries when we're starting out, because often all we are accomplishing is learning a language, or all we are accomplishing is just trying to get past the culture shock. And there's not a lot of glorious reports. We want to be able to write and say, this many people got saved, this many people got delivered, this many people got healed, and we want to give these glowing reports of revival. But honestly, that's not always there in the beginning, and not always there even in the future. Sometimes there's long seasons where you're just occupying a space and continuing. There are some mission fields that are like, for instance, Japan, with less than 1% Christian in that nation. If you know anything about the history of Japan, you would understand why. That you can't, nobody's writing newsletters about this many hundred getting saved or this many doing that or the other. No, the newsletters are more about camps and church. And when you hear about those camps, those churches are people that have been saved their whole lives. And new souls coming in, you won't hear as much. We pray, of course, that would change as we move to the future. We pray for a great revival to take place, and it can. But as for now, no, not necessarily. So the fruit of your ministry has to be more than that. The fruit of your ministry can be what you're preaching on, what you're teaching on, what's God speaking to you. You speak on that level, and people will be interested in hearing it. Now, the other one is your personal life, right? So in your personal life, this is what you're personally learning and experiencing, what you are going through in your heart as a missionary, as a husband, as a father, as a mother and a wife. In this regard, if you're a single missionary, then what are you developing in friendships and relationships? And I find people, honestly, however, are less interested in this area and more interested in the fruit of your ministry. Most people just want to hear what's going on. How's it going out there on the mission field? Oh, it's great. We're learning. God is moving in the services. We had a church camp where we went and this many kids participated, and we had a baptism and this many people got baptized, and this is what people like to hear. In fact, people are more inclined to support you in the ministry when they hear about these things that you're doing. But sometimes missionaries believe that the hardship stories or the misery is what's going to cause them to gain more compassion. And from my experience, it's not true. Years ago, this is interesting, and as I said, we're going to speak about this in depth later. Years ago, I was told from a veteran missionary to be careful about talking about your sickness to people. And when I was sick, very sick on the mission field. I mean, when I'm talking sick, I'm talking about dying sick several times, and amoebic dysentery multiple times, and typhoid and hepatitis and dengue many times. I mean, I should be dead. I should be dead at this point. I've eaten things around the world that have almost crippled me, but I'm alive and well and healthy, as you can see, and I feel great for a 53-year-old. My resting heartbeat is in the low 50s. That's athletic. I am comfortable. I hike in the woods. I feel great. Yay! And I'm enjoying life. But there was a time I was very sick, and I was told early on, don't communicate your sickness in your newsletters. Don't tell the people you're sick. You write and say, woe is me, I'm sick, I'm sick, I'm sick. And suddenly this image is created in them of you as a failure. But when it comes to support of your ministry, people don't want to hear about your weakness. They want to hear about your accomplishments, or better said, God's accomplishments through you. So that's just a little note I'll give you right now. Now, if you personally are talking to someone, maybe your pastor, then you can talk about your sickness with them. You can mention it and ask for prayers. But nobody likes a whiny person. And sometimes missionaries that are out there suffering can get whiny. Wah, 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 this problem, that problem, the other problem. No, I say, suck it up, as we say in the U.S. Just stand up and make it, and put a face on, and make yourself, even like when it says you're fasting, put some makeup on, the Bible says, and clean your face and act as if you're not fasting. It's kind of like that when you're going through any kind of trials or difficulties. Don't act like you're suffering, even if you are suffering, but continue in fidelity regardless of that. And so if we're the kind of people, though, that thrive on attention, and then of course we'll fall into that position. So we're all this we're seeing right now in talking about the relationship and the obligations of the missionary to his home church and our personal finances, to be accountable for the church, to know our needs, and then in communication, that the themes of your communication, the fruit of your ministry, your personal life. Now, in conclusion of this particular section that we're in, this concludes the section on the relationship between the missionary and the sending church. So the relationship that the missionary forms and maintains with the sending church is very important to the well-being of the ministry of the missionary abroad. And I hope that the missionary candidate takes this seriously and cultivates a vibrant and excited relationship with all involved in the sending church, starting with the pastor and then working their way through all this process. And that's exactly what happened with me. By the time 17, saved in the church, entered into that relationship with my pastor, and we had a great father-son connection. Not many fathers do you have, but I had one for sure. I have a biological father still on earth today, my dad in Buffalo, New York. But then after that, I had a spiritual father who nurtured me in the ways of God and led me and helped me through all of this. And I thank God for him every day that he was in my life. And I carry a legacy from him and of him. So after that, I related to the home church, to the brothers and the sisters, and the Norman Richmond, and the Mike Caminita, and the Kerry Roldan, and the Keith Bob Simple, and the Mike Gaskin, Mike and Billy, his wife at the time, and Billy Gaskin's in fact watching right now because she's been going through these teachings, and she was always a blessing. I learned so much about prayer from her, and she always had that beautiful, kind, motherly presence when I was a young believer. I used to love to go over to their house and spend time with them and learn. So in their relationship in the home church, I grew and developed. And when it came time for me to be trained and sent, I went and I was blessed, and I had that covering and that protection. The early years, it was just amazing. And I was able to go back to the home church and share from the pulpit. I remember back finally in 1995 when we entered into revival, and I had that amazing visitation of the Spirit. I was able to take that testimony back to my home church. And when I preached it, it made an impact in the church, and people were touched, people were encouraged. My original pastor, Ken Dunbar, at that time had gone to New Mexico, and he was pastoring there, and I was able to go visit there. And we had a special series of meetings and a revival. We did hours each day for a week straight, like 8 days straight of multiple hours of services, and the Spirit of the Lord came greatly as I testified about what God was doing on the mission field and how God was operating. It was wonderful to have that experience, all as I saw full circle my relationship. As we started in the foundation of the fact that I, a missionary and his God, I grew in that atmosphere, and then I became a part and a team player, and then I became a sent person, sent out to the mission field to carry the message of and the truths that I learned from that community. That's where I was able to represent Christ in that capacity. And it was a great experience. I love everything that I went through. Then, after seeing that whole perspective and knowing it, I began to create churches. And those churches, I knew, I just now need to make these churches exactly what I've experienced. You reproduce who you are and what you've been through. So from the very beginning, the churches that we planted, we knew that we needed to raise up leaders. We needed to raise up individuals and send them to the mission field and empower them to go out and teach and preach the gospel to the people. And we did that. It was very, very, very eventful, successful, and so many wonderful experiences that I had. And I thank God for it. If you're not currently part of a local church, I recommend that you do become part of that. If you are I'll just extend this, if you're watching this and you happen to be in Singapore and you're hearing about all these principles and you're hearing about this connection in the church with the purpose of making your way to the mission field or making your way to ministry and being capacitated and equipped for that, you may not be finding that where you are now, or maybe that environment is not conducive to missions work, etc. Well, I'm here to serve and help you. I will do anything I can to assist you. As you've already gained from this, I do not necessarily have unlimited finances to support you, but what I do have, I'll give you in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Rise up and walk. I will say, go. Go. Even silver and gold is not always what it's about. It's about the Spirit of God. It's about equipping. It's about learning these principles. And it's about learning them from someone who has learned them and has lived them. That I will impart to you, I will give to you. If you are in the other nations watching this and you feel like my church simply does not understand my perspective, it doesn't understand, well, maybe it's part of what you've learned in this lesson on the relationship of the missionary and his sending church, maybe you have not spoken to them enough. If you're missions minded and you're in your home church, does your church have a missions department? If it doesn't, don't sit around and whine and complain because your church doesn't have a missions department. How about you starting a missionary department? How about you initiating the construction of a prayer bulletin board for missionaries? How about you being the one that causes a homogeneous group to grow for missionaries to be nurtured? Before you ever leave your church, you can become a catalyst for the development of people with this unique call that we're talking about. So you start that missions club or that group. However, you want to make sure that this is done in coordination with your pastor. And so you relate to the pastor and the leaders by talking about missions and the need for that. If you believe it, and it is in your heart and soul, it will come out of you. It will emanate from you, and people will be convinced by it. So you create the structure so that missions can be promoted through your church. And this is what I did in my home church. This is where I worked hard to create and do. I'll never forget when I first talked to the pastor about it. At that time in our church, we did not have a lot of information around, and I thought it's a shame people can't see more and hear more about this. So I asked for permission to create some type of a display in the church. Would it be possible? And I was given permission, yes, and even shown a spot in the church foyer at the entrance point where I could put this display. Well, that was it. I was so excited. I immediately went out and gathered all the materials. I got a large part of wood, very big, 3 meters across, easy. You know, this is like a 10-foot wide display board, about 3 foot high, 4 foot high, you know, a couple of meters tall, and or a meter and a half tall. And I then got framing to make it look like it was a framed picture, and I got a very big sheet of plastic or plexiglass for the front of it to be like an enclosure. And then on that board I got burlap sack, you know, these sacks that you put things in. Back then we had burlap sacks where we would carry oysters and crawfish, etc. Back then, now they have more of a plastic netting. So I took the burlap and I spread it as the base on that wood, which made a really rustic background. And then upon that I got pieces of colored, blue colored poster paper, and I cut mats out of them, frame mats for pictures, and I took pictures from somewhere around 100 National Geographic magazines that I had, that I cut images of tribes, languages, groups, nations. At the center of this board I had the world, meaning a National Geographic map of the whole world, and on that each of these pictures was placed, and in relation to the nations that they were near. At the top of that I had Mark chapter 16, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, and you know, this beautiful old English style. And I had different references and names on massive thing, and we put it on the wall. And every time someone walked into the church, the first thing that they saw was this massive missions display board, which of course made anyone that came to the church for the first time think, wow, this church is really into missions, which it was, because I was into missions. But you understand, I was the catalyst behind that. Now, the church had been supporting missionaries before me, but this was bringing it out. And right at that time, right after I put that board up, there was in fact a young couple that came to visit the church. It's one of the first things they saw, and immediately they were impacted and started making plans in their lives and wanted to meet with me, and we became friends, and they became missionaries. And then others felt the call. And the young people, because of my influence in the home church, I told you I worked and functioned in many realms. I became an educator. From the first of all, I worked in the nursery. I changed diapers. I did everything that had to be done. I worked janitorially. I worked with mopping, sweeping, cleaning, vacuuming, everything I could do. And then I worked my way up into the kindergarten class in teaching. And then in the first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, sixth, seventh, I ended up with the teenagers, which of course was like a nightmare. One thing I found that I could do is bribe everybody with a bag of Doritos. And so every class I would put the chips on the desk and said, if you're obedient and you listen to me, we get these chips at the end of the class. And everybody was always obedient. So I had my techniques. But you know what I always talked about in all these classes was missions, because that's all I believed in, all I had in my mind. And so I was speaking to kids, little children in first, second, third grade, kindergarten, about the mission field, going to the mission field. These seeds were going into them. I was a catalyst for the mentality of the whole world, that we look at the sheep spread abroad and scattered around the world, and so therefore we are moved with compassion and we pray to the Lord of the harvest. That's where the name of my ministry came from, Moved with Compassion, in the United States. I'm the president and founder of a missions organization called Moved with Compassion. And that group sends and connects the finances for missionaries to go. If you're in the United States of America and you need a channel, a 501c3 nonprofit group that will help to bring money in so that it can support you, you need a channel for it, I'm there for you. There's a minimal fee that goes to the administrative office just so that your taxes can be done properly, etc. All of that. By my initiation, by the way, I founded all of that. I did all those things. It takes a lot of work to do the paperwork. I made the application for the 501c3 status, and I worked hard, and people came along to help me with it and helped us put all this together, and God has blessed me through the years to be able to do it. And those kids in those classes that heard these principles burned in their hearts, and by the time they got older, they wanted to be missionaries and asked me if they could. One after the other became missionaries, these young people. Then when they grew up, and I had already been out on the mission field for a long time, I remember it started by them just coming down to visit us and then falling in love with the mission field and then dedicating to the work and then coming and working in the ministry there in Mexico where we were. And then in other nations, they came into other countries and other places. Basically, wherever we went, they connected and their ministries developed. And this is still going on to this day. So I'm talking to you as an individual in your sending church. How does a missionary relate to the sending church? You impact it. You impact it with so deeply and so intensely. You burn so brightly in the short time that you're there before you go to the mission field that the people support you, follow you, and are motivated to be in your ministry and to be a part of what you're doing in the future, and by extension become their own ministries. And this is our legacy. This is our, for posterity's sake, people will connect to us when we do this, and we need to burn in our hearts. Do you really believe that God's calling you to do these things? Then you will be committed to it. So this is what we've seen so far in human relations in world missions. We've seen the missionary and his God. That's the whole first segment. And now we've been looking at the missionary and the sending church. Next, we're going to go into the missionary and the body of Christ, because there's a difference between the local church and the universal church, and we will come back to that right after our break.